It's a list of the worst Christmas morning that a child could have had in 1988. Yes, welcome to another NES Works special.
The lack of resolution of his themes almost adds to a vaguely literal internal transformation of his subject.
It's an external transformation.
"1988 may have been the year that the NES took its vitamins and leveled up to enshrine itself forever as the most popular console of the 1980s. But you'd better believe that not every game to ship that year for the system was a brilliant diamond. After all, no Jim's collection is complete without its share of coprolites. The interesting thing about all of these games is that, while deeply flawed, very few if any are truly terrible. Compared with the worst things that washed up on Famicom in Japan that year, or some of the malformed chunks of code that plagued the NES in its later life, 1988's worst would have a fair amount of charm. I could actually imagine people genuinely liking a lot of these games. I don't agree, but man, if you're 9 years old in 1988 and these are the only carts you have, and video games are still very much a wow, I can't believe I am moving a little guy around on screen sort of novelty, there's no shame in loving these gentle train wrecks. As before, I'm not here to bag on bad games. These messes aren't beyond redemption, in my opinion. Their creators didn't set out to create bad games, and I have a few thoughts on how they could be tweaked to tolerability. After my last worst of list, it would seem kind of weird not to have 1988's Ikari Warriors sequel represented here in some form. Except that, well, somehow Micronix added a few things to that port. A little bit of ambition. Actually means it doesn't belong on this list. So here it is in the runner-up slot. I don't want to disappoint my fans. Micronix tried to improve on Ikari Warriors by stretching the levels to 2 or 3 times their length as in the arcade, which had the effect of making a bad game 2 or 3 times as bad, because there was 2 or 3 times as much bad content. That same developer returns here, and they also make some tweaks to the design of this sequel. But this time around, Micronix seems to have taken some notes from their former bosses and attempted to give Victory Road a Capcom-style overhaul. Let there be no question about it, this is not a masterpiece of reinvention like Bionic Commando. And Victory Road still suffers from the interface limitations of the NES controller, which makes the coin-op's loop lever rotation setup impossible. And yes, you still have those chugging Micronix animations and the constant frame rate skips. But this time the jank is accompanied by an attempt to add some adventure elements to the game. You can acquire weapons in shops, you can enter taverns, and challenge other warriors to one-on-one combat. There is a sense here that you're not just grinding through battlefields, but actually fighting your way through an alien world. And it's kind of evocative. It's not good, of course, and SNK's own work on Iron Tank would offer a much better take on the same concept. But damn it, Micronix is trying here, and that might be the single greatest piece of praise I can offer the NES 1988 library. Like a lot of 1988 releases, Dr. Chaos combined a lot of different concepts and genres into a single action-adventure hybrid with grand ambitions. But Dr. Chaos proves that mere ambition does not quality make. If Micronix had made The Goonies 2, it might have played like this. Or maybe a better point of reference would be Atlantis no Nazo, or Milon's Secret Castle. Whatever the inspiration, Dr. Chaos takes place in a haunted mansion where you spend a lot of the game searching for paths forward. These paths are contained in rooms that switch to a first-person adventure mode that involves a lot of searching and hitting objects. From here, you can enter warp zones that take you to stages where you fight bosses. So, I guess I should point to Portopio Renzoku Satsujin Jiken and Deadly Towers here, too? Dr. Chaos basically wants to be every minor adventure-inflicted hit ever to see Famicom, while also being an action game. And I don't hate the idea. But the execution stumbles badly, with poor controls and unbalanced gameplay that make it too vague and punishing to be entertaining. There is a kernel of a great game here, and with a more refined action aspect and less blind groping for solutions, Dr. Chaos could have been something special. Instead, it's a bad game that feels all the worse for the potential it squanders. Capcom and Disney have become a pairing synonymous with quality for Nintendo fans, but you'd never know it from this first mutual outing. But Capcom didn't build this game. Hudson did. And it dropped in Japan a couple of years before it shipped here. So it's another studio's game from, effectively, another era of Famicom design. Like I said, a difficult start. Now, games developed in 1986 weren't necessarily bad, but Hudson made some missteps here, and that misstep is Minnie Mouse. No, this isn't some sexist rage-bait troll. Nothing wrong with a playable lady in a video game. Viva Princess Toadstool. No, the problem with Minnie Mouse is that you don't actually play as her. Instead, she's a computer-controlled companion who follows Mickey around. The computer is not very good at controlling her, which is a shame. Her well-being affects Mickey's, so you need to help protect her from her own automated incompetence. This turns a game that would be pretty tough, but ultimately reasonable, and even slightly interesting, into a real exercise in frustration. If Minnie just worked more like the Shadow Ninjas in Ninja Gaiden 2, or if she weren't vulnerable to dangers, it would be fine. But being forced to play this game while managing the incompetence of computer intelligence attempting to replicate human behavior makes Mickey Mousecapade less a vanguard of Capcom Disney greatness and more like a bellwether of a dark reality in which all of us have AI automation inflicted on us to make everything worse, stupider, and more time-consuming. Renegade spawned the entire belt-scroller genre, and it birthed two timeless franchises, Double Dragon and River City. Nevertheless, the NES port of this game kind of blew chunks, if we're being honest. I will say that despite being reskinned to change all the teenage Yankee toughs of the Japanese release into American street punks, Renegade is pretty faithful to the arcade game, at least in terms of concept and level design. It's also much uglier than the arcade game, not to mention the fact that it plays a lot less smoothly, and, well, there's not a huge amount to this game. So when you strip out the graphics and make it kind of awkward, you lose the source material's entire appeal. Renegade made waves for adding some interesting depth to the idea of martial combat, literally. It allowed players to move into and out of the background rather than just playing in a fixed 2D side perspective. It also gave its protagonist a wider range of combat skills, including the unsportsmanlike ability to pile onto a downed foe and beat the crap out of them while they recovered. Pretty great. But here it's also pretty rough. Better programming and art, Renegade for NES could have been pretty good, but instead it had to go face-to-face with its own vastly prettier and more refined sequel, Double Dragon, almost day and date. Talk about an unsportsmanlike beatdown. Although it deserves credit for being one of the first console games to latch on to the West Coast extreme sports fad of the late 80s, and for tying itself to a major subculture fashion brand in the process, that's about all the credit that TNC Surf Design deserves. This is a simple, shallow, and kind of annoying game. There are 2 events here versus 4 or 5 for the closest analog California games: skateboarding and surfing. Surfing the Halfpipe plays almost exactly like the version in California games, which developer Atlas must have absolutely been ripping off here. Skateboarding, on the other hand, plays more like California games roller skating, except faster and less clumsy. That, I suppose, marks an improvement over the material being pilfered, but not enough to justify this cartridge. TNC Surf Design really just hangs on the appeal of, well, TNC Surf Design. It wears the branding and weirdo characters of a popular surf apparel brand from the time. I'm afraid that being able to surf as Thrilla Gorilla, rather than as some anonymous stick figure, does not represent enough of a perk to make this NES game a good value. With a few more events and more variety within those events, TNC Surf Design would have played as good as it looks. But I suppose that was outside the bounds of the assignment, which was to make a really cheap, quick, easy cash-in game for LJN. So we got this, the minimum viable product. As the first unlicensed release for NES, this home port of an Atari Games arcade hit has a place in history, even though a few months later, Mindscape published it actually under license, which makes it even more notable and weird. I don't know why they thought this game, of all games, merited that kind of effort. Atari Games' Temple of Doom was okay in arcades, giving players a fast, rambunctious, action-driven take on the Indiana Jones concept. Lots of swinging around, rescuing kids, and riding minecarts. And it looked pretty good, a decent and wholly acceptable way to spend 25 cents. That game lost something in translation to NES and a $40 cartridge. Not just a certain level of visual finesse, but also some degree of playability and refinement. It's clumsier, more repetitive, less fun. A watered-down arcade port like Renegade, but even less confident in itself, not to mention more likely to get players stuck in a frustrating loop of minecart rails while they attempt to pathfind their way to the end of a stage. I can only assume that this game managed to bob to the surface twice in rapid succession as an attempt to capitalize on indie mania in light of the forthcoming Last Crusade. Still, it's kind of funny that of the multiple 1988 NES games to feature Nazis and Hitler as villains, one of them was not Indiana Jones. Like Rambo and Golgo 13, you get the impression that Superman from Kemco was created by developers who really wanted to go big and do something inventive and original with their license. Unlike Rambo and Golgo 13, Superman from Kemco really misses the mark. The funny thing about Superman is that it actually shipped for Famicom a few weeks after Rambo, late December 1987, but it has the look and janky feel of a game from much earlier. If you told me this was a summer 1986 Famicom release, I'd absolutely believe it. It has that sort of clumsy ambition that you saw in games which debuted immediately in the wake of Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. The floodgates of potential for console games had been opened, but no one was quite sure yet how to recreate that Nintendo magic. But no, this came out after Metroid, and The Goonies 2, and Rygar, and quite a few other games that took a similar tack to Superman, but did it better, and with much nicer visuals and gameplay. You play here as both Clark Kent and Superman, patrolling a sort of open-world version of Metropolis, complete with a functioning subway system, attempting to put a stop to bad guys, including rogue Kryptonians. On its surface, Superman seems like it should work, but its objectives are so abstract, and the fundamentals of the action, like moving around and fighting enemies, so miserable that it's hard to see much in the way of redeeming qualities here. Like a lot of the worst games of 1988, Superman could have been a solid game in better hands. With stronger fundamentals and a more approachable quest and navigation setup, Superman would have been a knockout. The idea of a semi-persistent metropolis that you have to manage in both of Kal-El's identities has a lot of merit. Simon's Quest demonstrated that NES games could operate in an open world with a loose quest structure, and it debuted in Japan nearly half a year before Superman. This is one of those games where you can really understand how kids who encountered it at a young age and spent months attempting to figure it out would have a lot of residual fondness for it. But that still doesn't make it, good. I suppose in a lot of ways, Saycross isn't actually horrible. Maybe it's not even a bad game. But as a 1988 release, it feels so hollow and lacking that I'm including it on this list just to make it feel bad about itself. Likewise, its partner release, Magmax. Two auto-scrolling combat action ports from the arcade that look like relics of the very earliest days of the Famicom, somehow selected by FCI as two of the games that they should definitely manufacture in massive quantities for Americans in the year of our Lord, 1988. I don't really get the thinking there, because these carts both feel massively dated. And not in the fun, timeless way of some other 1988 arcade conversions like Bubble Bobble Pac-Man, Galaga, Xevious. These just feel stale and out of date. They're not the worst games on NES by any means, but I really think that these should have hit the NES in about December 1986 to have had a fighting chance of feeling like a good way to spend your allowance. Sitting against Gradius, they'd have been pretty okay. As contemporaries of Life Force and Contra, that timing was not doing either of these games any favors. When people think bad licensed games, this is the kind of sloppy, unenjoyable mess that they have in mind. Even though Bandai was too cheap to actually license the Dragon Ball property for the West, so people had no idea that this was even a licensed game to begin with. What the hell, Bandai? Dragon Power attempts to convert a big chunk of the Dragon Ball anime into a video game adventure. If you know the material, you can see that they didn't make too dramatic an effort to rework the content to obscure the source property. But that's neither here nor there. What gives Dragon Power such a high showing on this list is, well, it's not actually a very good adaptation of Dragon Ball. You play as Goku, wandering around a world a level at a time. Although the game is divided into stages, each individual stage has a somewhat open layout with multiple paths, caverns, buildings, and more. Sometimes the view switches from an overhead perspective to that of a side-scroller, making this a sort of slightly refined knockoff of Hudson's Challenger. But where you could kind of forgive the sloppy, unfriendly action of Challenger when that game shipped a mere week after Super Mario Bros., this kind of fare didn't fly in 1988. The flaws here come down to familiar fundamentals. Poor visuals, poor controls, poor collision handling, poor enemy AI, poor level design. It's a reasonably interesting take on an adventure presented through a substandard lens. Worst of all, the fact that Bandai locked down the Dragon Ball license for this Famicom release means that Sega had to scramble to rework their own Dragon Ball adaptation. This game is the reason why we have Alex Kidd, and some sins are too grave to forgive. As I said last episode, 1988 was the year where a lot of early NES sports games finally saw follow-ups. And by far, the absolute worst of them was, ironically, the one to bear a league license. Major League Baseball from LJN. Way to go, guys. I can't actually offer any advice for salvaging this one. It's an extraordinarily wretched clone of Namco's Family Stadium, the incredibly popular clone of Nintendo Baseball that shipped here around the same time as MLB, as RBI Baseball. Receiving these two releases in tandem really made you appreciate how fine details make the difference between a decent game and a vomitous one. MLB does literally nothing right besides tying up the Major League license, and I don't know anyone who would rather play a bad game with recognizable franchises than a good game with made-up teams. This cartridge isn't even good as kindling because the plastics that make up the shell emit toxic chemicals when burned, making this an absolute waste of material. I don't really know what Activision's plan was when they decided to bring over this port of David Crane's Ghostbusters to NES. If the intention was to make people hate the NES, well, it's a good start. Ghostbusters takes David Crane's Commodore 64 hit and mangles it almost beyond recognition. Maybe it's not the single worst NES game of 1988, the gulf in quality between this and the original game that it was adapted from certainly makes it the most gravely offensive. On C64, Ghostbusters played more like a business simulation than anything else. You needed to manage a Ghostbusters franchise, acquiring the resources and funds to fight ghosts, while racing against the rising psychokinetic energy that threatened to plunge the city into a haunted nightmare. The NES game kind of does that too, but it downplays the simulation in favor of highlighting the action sequences that comprised a small portion of the computer game. You spend a lot more time catching ghosts with a cumbersome team setup, and you have to battle your way to the top of the Empire State Building for the final showdown using that same awkward control scheme. That's frustrating enough on its own, but for some reason, the team behind this conversion decided that the little cutscenes that depict the Ecto-1 automatically arriving at its destination on computer should be interactive. Not the worst impulse, I suppose, but it is a mess here. The driving scenes are boring as hell, a dull and repetitive exercise in barely dodging other cars, while attempting to catch ghosts en route. Worse though, there's a fuel mechanic here that causes you to burn more gas the further across the city you drive. This means that crossing the map will probably use more than a single tank of fuel, meaning that simply getting around invariably results in your car petering out and being forced to the side of the road, wasting time and money as you refuel it. It is a terrible addition that utterly ruins the game. The sad thing is, it could have threaded the needle between sim and action quite nicely. I know this for a fact because Compile's Master System conversion of Ghostbusters arrived in the US a full year before the NES game, and it was fantastic. Not only did it look and sound great, it played up the sim elements and kept the car sequences brief, giving the game a more console-like action quality without abandoning the depth of the original. In fact, the Master System port might be the actual best version of Ghostbusters on any platform. That's in stark contrast to this, the worst Ghostbusters port, and the 1988 NES game I personally hate the most. It's a game so bad it makes you wish Gozer the Gozerian were real, just so she'd destructor this stupid cartridge into oblivion. On the next NES Works special, something a little different.